Welcome everyone to today's session in Womb Wellness Week. I have the honor and joy of being in conversation with my sister Faaizah Patel. Sister Faaizah will be talking to us today about some of the roots of fertility challenges and issues that are becoming so common today. So Sister Faaizah has experience as a clinical nurse specialist, a surgical nurse, and also in oncology research, but she also has this beautiful complementary education in naturopathic medicine in the United tradition, as well as a postgraduate degree in Islamic psychology. So she has this beautiful approach of incorporating a holistic perspective that incorporates the mind, body, and soul in approaching healing from both the Islamic and Greco Arabian tradition. So excited to have you here, sister. Thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum salam, Chantal. It's truly an honor being here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for your generous introduction. Inshallah, this will be beneficial for many women.
Yeah, I really love to talk about this issue because it's so surprising to me. So since I've been in the practice of womb steaming and serving women and educating women, I'm always really surprised when women in their 20s and early 30s are telling me that they're pursuing IVF or pursuing IUI, or they were told they had low ovarian reserve. And it to me it speaks to a global issue. Something bigger is happening because there's no reason why 20 something year old couples should be struggling to conceive. This is like peak time, prime time in our fertile lives. So can you just kind of help us orient to what's happening globally, why fertility seems to be like something that's harder to achieve or that's being threatened?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very good question to start with, and it is very surprising when I see that too, because like you said, the 20s are the time where our ovarian reserve is actually meant to be at its strongest. It starts to decline from age 30 onwards. So some of these factors, there's quite a few that come to mind. Number one being like the lack of um, like the nutrients and nutrition. So globally, there's been a decline in the quality and the actual potency of our food. So due to various reasons, it could be due to agricultural practices and farming practices, or the way that in society, the way that food is being produced, they're looking to get a really quick yield without honoring the process of the vegetables and the crops to be able to grow. They're just looking for it to grow really, really fast and to get the most yield and to have such a high turn around. So because of these kind of methods, our food isn't containing the same values of nutrients that they did in the past. And additionally, with the rise of like fast food, generally speaking, in America, there's definitely not enough of a vegetable intake. Is something it's an issue. So people just aren't eating more plant-based diets. This is something that's actually emphasized in the Sunnah as well. If you look at the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had primarily a vegetarian diet and he rarely ate meat. So if we look at that, and then also the principle of having tayyib food. So tayyib means food that's without the pesticides, the herbicides, ideally organic as well. So young girls are just not being, kind of raised on good, proper nutrition. Fast food and outside food is something that's more kind of readily available and incorporated. And it means that we're just not having those building blocks to create the hormones, to create, an ideal organs of elimination, such as liver. There's lots of liver congestion that we see, and there's lots of metabolic health issues that we see. So that's my second point. And we see the rise of metabolic health issues. So we're seeing children younger and younger who are developing high BMI. So obesity is on the rise. Childhood obesity is something that is it's like an outward symptom of a deeper kind of imbalance that's happening. So if someone has that high BMI, then they're likely to have insulin resistance. So with insulin resistance, that's going to affect their chances of fertility directly because it increases the amount of testosterone in the body. It wreaks havoc on the endocrine system at large. So insulin resistance, diabetes, high blood pressure, high BMI, these are all factors that can hamper fertility, and along with the nutrient deficiency, decline, the ovarian reserve that we're supposed to have in our 20s. And then speaking to my next point, I feel like stress is a big one. I think with all of the changes that came with like the feminist movements and this notion that you know women can do everything that men can do and more, is physiologically it's proven that the more that we take on a physical basis, so even athletes have been found to have a hampered fertility because that those high levels of stress hormones that we're kind of taking on through working full time and then doing the emotional work and the mental work in the home and everything else, is meaning that our cortisol levels are a lot higher. We're not allowing our bodies the chance to recover and rest and have that mental break. So when our cortisol level is chronically high, then there's something that happens in our physiology called the pregnenolone steal, and basically it's there's so much hikmah and wisdom in that, how Allah Subhanahu wa Taala created our bodies, because it's basically saying that the world is not a safe place to bring a child into. Cortisol levels are too high. The woman is in fight or flight for such a long period of time, and the body kind of shuts down certain functions to favor others. So fertility is probably, one of the first, because the body is just trying to maintain survival essentially, and thinking it's not a good time to have a baby right now. So stress is a big one. So that is something that I work on with all of my clients, looking at their emotional load, their physical load, their mental load, and working on ways to try and reduce stress. Especially, this is something separate called perceived stress, and then the actual stress. So the body doesn't know the difference between if a woman is working to tight deadlines and having to attend these high pressure meetings, and the body is kind of taking on the effects of that. It doesn't know the difference between that stress and like a lion running towards her. The cortisol levels are going to be just as high, and the effects are going to be just the same. So reducing our perceived stress. So in my work, I like to identify that I'm not saying that women shouldn't work and be CEOs in their workplace and strive towards being the best that they can in their careers. But I like to emphasize is that, because certainly we can do all of those things, but we need to have that. I like to call it the yin time, where we're unwinding, we're in a state of flow. And when we have our downtime, we're not kind of on screens or watching Netflix or on social media, because that's not actually downtime. That's still it's not kind of deep relaxation. So, kind of working on and really maximizing that downtime and how to do that. So, I emphasize a lot of yin yoga, for example, is wonderful for opening up our yin channels, working psychosomatically with the breath through practices like yoga, qigong. Meditation is another wonderful one. It brings our nervous system all the way kind of down, and also having a sense of creativity and flow. So that's something that I really like to emphasize, because it's not something that we can actually check too much biologically. If we go to the doctors and say that we are, you know, experiencing issues with having a baby, they're not going to check our cortisol levels. And even if they do, there's so many factors. So if it's taken in the morning, we all have a peak in the morning. It's not something that's usually detected or even checked for. So through working more one to one with practitioners who are seeing you as an individual and looking at everything in a holistic way, looking at your lifestyle, your diet, your wake time, your sleep time. That's going to kind of really allow for a much more tailored, individualized approach. Um, so yeah, going back to your question, we mentioned the lack of nutrients in our diets, the metabolic health, which we're seeing in the statistics everywhere with high BMI and childhood diabetes and those types of metabolic issues, and then the high stress and the lack of downtime. And we see that in children as well. From a young age, we're seeing more and more depression in young children, anxiety in young children. So we're kind of, unfortunately, it's not setting them up for success, not only biologically and their health, but with fertility as well is part and parcel of the same thing. And then I don't want to leave out the circadian rhythm piece is a huge one because with the advent of, screens and phones, sometimes we're on them even in the evening time, and that kind of the artificial blue light can really affect our circadian rhythm in that melatonin isn't able to actually start secreting because the body's confused thinking the artificial blue light is actually sunlight, and there's so much repair and there's so much restoration, there's so much that actually happens when we're sleeping, and if we're impeding on that through exposure to blue lights, then it's going to really affect, to be honest, like it's the foundation of all of our health to kind of stand upon is our sleep wake cycles. And subhanallah, even in the Quran Sharif, and if we have a look at the Islamic tradition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything in a state of balance and harmony. And there's direct references to the day and the night and the activity and the rest. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created everything in a state of harmony and there's ayat in that, then we have to really honor the need for restful sleep and not allow the yang or the outward energy of the day and productivity and screens to seep into our time, and really respect and honor that need for rest and sleep and repair and optimizing that. So that's another one. And then gut health is another one. So there's a direct link between our gut health and our vaginal microbiome, or they call it specifically the estrobolome. So if we're seeing much more gut health issues these days, Crohn's, IBS, colitis, or general like leaky gut. And if that's something that is affecting someone from a younger age, such as someone in the 20s, that's also going to be impacting their strobolome and our vaginal bacteria and our vaginal health in general. So those factors I feel like might be causing that. And then, oh, sorry, just to mention as well, globally there's a decline in sperm count as well, significantly. I think in the last 50 years it has dropped quite dramatically, and if we're kind of looking at things from the male and female perspective, then that's something that's going to have a direct impact on conception. If sperm count is dropping, it's going to reduce the chances. So unfortunately, we have to try and address all of these things when working with clients, and also having a preventative approach with all of these things in our lifestyles, and educating our children as we raise them on the importance of our health, which is an amana. And doing that preventative health piece can really mitigate against our children and our young ones experiencing these, fertility issues in the 20s, 30s, and beyond. So I hope that answered your question, Chantal.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that because, we know that women tend to hold that burden on their own a lot, and there isn't enough conversation about the male component and how the couple, it's a challenge for the couple. And so in this, and sometimes you see women are doing all of the things. They're cleansing and they're working out and they're changing their diet and they're going to therapy, and their male partner's doing nothing, as if there's nothing for him to do. And so it's like actually both need to work together in tandem to create the best material for life. One thing that sometimes people think, oh, if we can't conceive, well, we'll just do IVF. Well, IVF can't give you good quality eggs and good quality sperm. That's your work to do. That's
Mm-hmm.
your nutrition. That's your lifestyle. That's your contribution. So
And just to add to that as well, when before we're doing IVF, it's always good to work on these things that I mentioned because it's going to improve your chances of success with IVF. So these are very foundational pillars, and I'm often so shocked to see when there's clients who have been through IVF, and I inquire about, how they worked on themselves to prepare for IVF, and they're like, "Oh, the clinic just took us without doing that workup, or I was just taking a prenatal beforehand," and it's like, and then unfortunately, we there's that chance of the IVF not being effective. So to really optimize ourselves, our bodies, and our physiology to prepare for IVF is a huge factor as well.
I always say I think it's criminal, frankly, to take someone's money for fertility treatment and you haven't even helped them understand the most basic elements of reproductive health and menstrual health, right? It's thinking that they are not connected. You know, your menstrual health is directly connected to your reproductive outcomes. And so, I may work with someone and they're like, yeah, I did IVF. And I said, well, what were your periods like? Oh, I didn't get periods. So naturally, there's going to be a fertility challenge if you're not menstruating on a regular basis, or someone who says, "Well, my periods, it's black blood or brown blood the entire period." Okay, well, how is there going to be a healthy place to implant
Yes.
a fertilized egg if your uterus is not getting fresh blood supply, if you're not shedding fresh lining on a regular basis? Like, it's just so much fundamental work to do. So I really am frustrated by how quickly and loosely people throw the term infertility around because it's very misleading. True infertility is called voluntary childlessness, and it's statistically extremely rare, like maybe 3% of the population, though, like 1 in 4 couples are having fertility challenges last time I heard. So what do you like, we've talked about those environmental and social and nutritional issues that could be coming up. But what's really like the psycho spiritual impact of us taking on this label of infertile, allowing our doctors to label us as infertile, or believing ourselves that I have infertility, like the permanence of that statement? How does that impact us?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I feel like there's so many kind of labels that are thrown around, and sometimes we do need to kind of think a little bit critically. Like, we have to think about, first of all, where are they coming from? Are they working from just one paradigm of healing and medicine? And then also digging a little bit deeper and saying, okay, like from an epistemological perspective, that's just Western medicine who's diagnosing that based off of such a reductionistic, mechanistic approach that is solely based on coming to that conclusion through just blood tests or scans. And I've very much worked in that industry, and there's so much hikmah and wisdom in that whole paradigm of healing, but it's not the be all and end all, in the sense that they don't have a monopoly over knowledge of the human body, of our constitution, of our state. So I think some of the work that we need to do is in thinking, okay, if I've been labeled as infertile, then this is something that is um, confined to that paradigm of healing, and that there's so many other paradigms of healing out there, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who can provide shifa, and who and has actually granted wisdom and hikmah to many traditions that were existing so many centuries and centuries before the advent of modern medicine. So I feel like, on our part, we need to kind of do some decolonizing work. I feel like, my parents were immigrants to the West, and I was born and raised in the UK, and I went into nursing school, and the knowledge that was presented as being the be all and end all of knowledge of health, of knowledge of well being, of knowledge of, our psyche and our makeup. And it's clearly not the case. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with a soul, and there's a much longer trajectory that we are part of. So taking into account that we were um, existence before we came into this world as souls, and that there's also an akhirah, that this world isn't the be all and end all, and that framing that um, there's I think that there's a fine line into understanding that there's hikmah in everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting us through, but it's an invitation to dig deeper, ask more questions. So some of that decolonial work could be looking like, for example, approaching different traditional modalities of healing. So, for example, when I started to study naturopathic medicine, I really deeply just fell in love with the reverence, the understanding, the appreciation for the intricate way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created each and every person in their individuality. Um, so we take into account the energetics of the human being in the sense that what is the actual mizaj? This is not something that can be quantified into bloods or scans. And in mainstream medicine, they're also very quick to surgically intervene. I found that when I moved from the UK to the States, it's very, very common, and we have to understand that it is a business in some countries, like in the USA, to have clients who want IVF, and there's an agenda behind that. But then on the flip side to that, we have to say, okay, what can we do to optimize our own well-being? What can I do to um, allow my body to have that preparedness for conception? And within the naturopathic approach, we have a look at the mizaj of each client and identify the imbalances. And oftentimes with the IVF clinics, or what I've heard many women say here in the States, is that they're taking a prenatal, and that's about as much as their preparedness is going. But in fact, if we had a lot more health literacy, a lot more body literacy, we'd know kind of, I teach my clients about the tracking their cycles to know when they're ovulating, because it's only like a 4 to 7 day window that we can actually conceive. So actually trying to conceive in those days, and then also looking at their underlying markers. So if they are experiencing symptoms of PCOS, or they're metabolically not well, they have insulin resistance, then working on that actively through looking at their diet, their nutrition, and also supplementing very kind of appropriately. So, working on um, lowering that blood sugar and having that, we can use the bloods to get that marker in the beginning as a baseline. And then, okay, we're implementing all of these ways that we're going to keep your blood sugar levels low and keep your insulin sensitivity high. And then supplements can help with that. There's like berberine, myo-inositol, and then the order in which we're eating our foods, and then the exercise piece, and then the stress piece. So working on these things on an individual basis is something that we can certainly do. But coming back to your question, in terms of like the psychospiritual aspect, it's an invitation for work to be done, and through a guided, through like a means of guidance, someone who is trained in that. And there's so much power between what you mentioned, meditation, that positive thinking, that hope and tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in the concept of tying our camel, in optimizing our bodies to be in a state of readiness for conception. And then also, I sometimes, if women have various psycho-emotional or psycho-spiritual blocks, then sometimes working on those, because that can create a deep kind of energy shift. Um, if there's any deep resentment, anger, hurt, trauma, pain, some of these things can physiologically be expressed in our body, and these are all things that need to be worked upon. Um, so I hope that answered your question. It's quite a complicated answer.
Yeah, but it's important because sometimes people take that and they spiritualize it like, oh, this is just my struggle or my jihad, my burden in life, or this wage, this divine battle that I have to wage. And but like you said, tying the camel, what's within the realm of what you can influence, right? Even if you're told your ovarian reserve is low, you can always impact the quality of your eggs, right? Your egg quality is something that you do have. You may not be able to control the quantity, but the quality. is something that we're always influencing and impacting. So I think that, that resolve is, to move beyond like, okay, this is just my struggle. I'm going to be patient and do nothing versus I'm going to make use of all of the beautiful tools available that might be outside of the paradigm I'm familiar with or trust in, and see what's within the realm of how I can influence. I'm really glad you mentioned yin, or like the feminine flow, kind of slow energy, because it's such a setup for everything that follows. If you There's just so much wisdom in your body preventing you from conceiving. If nutritionally you're not supporting your own self wealth, and how are you then going to support another life? If your stress levels are so high that you're not even getting adequate rest and care, then how is there going to be resources available to support another life? Um, Even the repair and recovery that's needed to recover from birth requires that slowing down and that rest. So, like you said, this idea that we can have it all, we can do it all, go, 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 it really doesn't lend itself to our physiology, which requires rest, which requires downtime and healing and work that doesn't necessarily happen in the day outside where everyone can see it, but it's in the dark, and it's in those unseen places where there needs to be like real restoration. So, thank you for speaking to that. You covered so much. So, I hope that it really gives people a new way of approaching or looking at their fertile status. What are some of the ways? And so like you, I also have a background in nursing, so I'm really interested from your um, kind of Western clinical experience to your naturopathic experience, your experience in Ayurvedic traditions as well. What are some of these universal indicators of a fertile period that women should be looking for and cluing themselves into, for earlier intervention and prevention, as you mentioned?
I hadn't, first of all, I didn't know you had a background in nursing. That's so
Mhm.
cool. What kind of
Yeah.
specialism were you in?
So I went to a vocational high school in New York City. I grew up in New York City, so I actually did my nursing training while I was in high school. So when
Okay.
I finished high school, I took my high school diploma, and then after the summer, I sat for my nursing board. So I was a LPN.
Mashallah.
So while I was in college, I worked in nursing homes primarily while I was going to school. So.
Right. That's amazing, mashallah. And thank you for that question. It's a very
Mhm.
good question. So a fertile period would typically look like okay, so let's go into the period, and then there's other kind of factors on the periphery of that as well. So the fertile period would be around 4 to 5 days long. The blood would be red from start to finish. If there's any brown blood, black blood, if there's any clots, they're signs of stagnation that needs to be corrected. And I do, in my Unanative consultation, I include a menstrual analysis to analyze and kind of dissect what is actually happening with the period. So yeah, 4 days long, red from start to finish, and then no cramps, ideally, because if there's cramps, it's a sign that the uterus is struggling to really discharge that blood and it's doing what it can to allow that cleanse to happen. So no cramps or like bloating. Um, what else? So no clots, and then um, I don't know if I'm missing something, but typically, yeah, the 4 days, the red blood, the no clots, the lack of brown, black blood, lack of the clots, they're all indicators of a healthy period. And then I feel like, the period is one marker, and then ovulation is another one. So if a woman is not ovulating, then it means that her egg isn't being released. And if her egg's not being released, then there's nothing for the sperm to, fertilize physiologically. So also, I feel like a menstruation tracking is very important, and knowing when our fertile days actually are. So that body literacy and that tracking can happen through tracking their basal body temperature. We go through like, that when did we rise and when when we're ovulating and afterwards. And then also the cervical mucus tracking, that's another indicator of ovulation. And then another sign would be some of our PMS symptoms in the luteal phase. So if progesterone isn't in harmony and balance with estrogen and testosterone and the other hormones, it's going to be showing up in our luteal phase in the form of cyclical headaches, cyclical acne, intense cramps, the psycho-emotional piece. Our hormones can sometimes just PMDD, for example, is something that's an extreme version of PMS, and all of those various symptoms that come with PMS. So, really looking to identify signs of progesterone deficiency, or even having a look at signs of testosterone excess. So, if there's, excess hair, if there's all of the other signs that are indicating hormonal imbalance, then that's something to factor in and consider. That these are all signs that we need to come back into a state of harmony and balance before we can optimize our chances of conception. So yeah.
Thank you for speaking to that because we often hear whatever your normal is normal for you. And it's like, well, 25-day cycles are not optimal for conception. So it can be really misleading. 40-day cycles are not optimal conception. Can conception happen on either extreme? For sure, right? Conception can happen if Allah chooses to do so. But in terms of the highest chances of conception, there is a real range, that 28 to 30-day menstrual cycle length. It's real. Or the quality of cervical mucus. Some people don't see cervical mucus, and I'm like, how is this not being discussed in fertility consultations? You have no cervical mucus. You never notice it. Like that's obviously another indicator of
Absolutely.
of fertility. It's actually having the mucus needed to keep the sperm alive, to nourish the sperm so it can reach the egg. So I'm also surprised how these things don't really get discussed. Um,
Exactly.
so to wrap up, this is a really important one. Um, so especially as we look at the period from a like a biological sense, right? And then Islamically, can you just speak to, because I think it can be really confusing when people learn about menstruation from a fiqh perspective first. And it's talking about like the maximum length of a period. For some madahib, it might be like 10 or 15 days. And I think it almost normalizes like, oh, that's very possible that I could be bleeding for more than 10 or 15 days. But I always feel like we first need to establish what's healthy. It's good to know what to do for your worship. So when you say a 4 to 5 day flow, I'm sure that there are Muslim women listening to like, what? Like to be done with my period. So I just wanted to make clear that when you say 4 to 5 day flow, you're talking about actual menstrual flow. You're not counting days of spotting that might
Right.
precede or follow, which shouldn't be excessive anyway. You shouldn't have an excessive amount of spotting both before and after the period are something to be like investigated and addressed as well. But um, if you can just speak to that distinction for people who are counting their period from a fifth perspective as opposed to a
Mm.
health perspective or medical perspective.
Yeah, I think I grasp your question, but it's a very good one actually because I have some friends who are alimas, and I know lots of people who do work with women in identifying, what their actual period is, and then what is haid, what is istihada, when can they pray, and it's amazing that there's access to those scholars who can help them with that. But we should actually also be asking, in the same breath, we should be asking ourselves, like, why am I bleeding for, I mean, more than 10 days? Why am I spotting, for example, throughout the whole month? Because these are all signs that there's an imbalance that's happening internally. And if we have a look at, subhanallah, the nature of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created our cycles in harmony. There's like, the yang period, there's the yin period, and there's also a metaphysical and spiritual benefit of us experiencing the follicular phase when it's healthy and not bleeding, the ovulatory phase. There's new insights and wisdoms and a spiritual connection that we can really energetically and in our direct ibadah feel during those times. So it's great to have the fiqh, and fiqh is definitely important. I feel like, it does take more precedence over what I'm saying, because we need to know when to pray. That's essential for, our akhirah. But just secondarily to that, we should be seeking access to finding out, why am I bleeding for these days? What can I do to bring my amana, which is my body that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gifted to me as a vehicle to travel through in this world. Why am I in a state of such imbalance, and what can I do to bring myself back into balance, because it's going to affect the quality of my ibadah. So sorry, with your question, I think, yeah, so just to clarify that, I mean that when I say a 4 day cycle, it's meant to be just that bleed at that time of the month, the winter period, the yin time, and no bleeding throughout the entire course of the 28 days. Because if there's spotting, that's a sign of uterine fatigue. I mean, we can get a little bit of spotting during ovulation. That's not uncommon, but typically it should be a good uterine cleanse only within them 4 days, 4 to 5 days of our period, and not outside of that. Um, so I hope that that answers your question. But I do feel like we need to do a lot more in bringing the Islam into our health, and realizing that trying to bring our cycles into a state of balance and harmony and regularity is very much part and parcel of our deen. Um, we can't neglect ourselves. All of these health issues that we're seeing, the childhood obesity, the metabolic health that is kind of skyrocketing in the world, is something that Muslims aren't immune to. And if we have a look and go back into our text, everything needs to be done in moderation. There's so much literature written on, not overeating. So some of Imam al-Ghazali's work on disciplining the two desires, one is the sexual appetite, the second is the appetite for food. And there's so many imbalances and so many health issues that are coming from transgressing against that basic principle of not overeating, and in the concept of having tayyib food. And tayyib doesn't only mean eating organic, but it's also in the form of tayyib consumption, can also mean what we're consuming in terms of our cosmetics, in terms of our water. So endocrine disruptors is a big one. It can be found in so many, so much makeup, cosmetics, perfume, in the water supply, in some of this fast food, processed food that we're consuming. We're transgressing against that concept of consuming tayyib when we are actually consuming those things that are harmful to us. So I feel like there's a call to really come back to basics, to go back to these basic principles, and to just reevaluate and say, and ideally we should be working towards women not having istihada issues. We should be working towards women not, you know, having to ask these questions about throughout their whole lives, when can I pray, fast, etc. Because it's like we should be all be striving towards ihsan and excellence. And there's so much space and room for that, and so much scope for that, with some of these conversations that we're having and these spaces that we're trying to create. And a lot of it is, subhanallah, part and parcel of my work. And thanks to people like you who are creating these spaces, bringing women together from different disciplines to have these discussions, and to kind of, open up our understandings of health, and from such a beautiful holistic perspective too. So, um, subhanallah, I just want to say on that note, thank you so much for your work, Chantal. It goes such a long way. May there be so much care in it for so many women, in helping us all come to a state of balance and harmony, and work on ourselves, physically, mentally, and psycho-spiritually as well.
Inshallah. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for bringing your experience and your wisdom to the conversation. So, how can people work with you if they want to explore naturopathy? Do you work with clients virtually? how can people access your services?
Yeah, so I do work with clients virtually. I use an app called Signal. It's a very secure app, more secure than Zoom. And I do unanimous consultations, but with the container itself, it's unanimous and is also Islamic psychology combined. Because as we were discussing in this interview, that sometimes, the psycho-emotional or psycho-spiritual piece is a big part of our physical health as well. So it's a container for holistic care to be accessed, and just understanding that it's a journey, it can take time, and I'm more than happy to work with clients, inshallah.
I feel like we're going to need even a little glossary for today's session, so many beautiful terms and what are some of the meanings for people who are unfamiliar. So, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for attending today. And inshallah, we look forward to continuing this dialogue, furthering the conversation. And thank you so much, Sister Faiza, for being with us today. Jazakallah khair. And inshallah, we will see you all tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa